それではですね、礼拝の御言葉の時を持っていきたいと思います。
And so with that, we'd like to just get into the message.
皆さんはですね、教会というのはどうしたら成長していると思えるでしょうか。
So have you guys ever wondered, how can I know that my church is growing?
また皆さんが所属しているコミュニティグループやまた組織でもどうしたら成長していると言えるでしょうか。
Or have you ever wondered, how can I know that the organization or the community that I'm a part of, how can I know that if it's growing or not?
ティモシー・ケラーはセンターチャーチという本の中で宣教の働きを評価する基準として成功でもなく信仰でもない実りというのを挙げています。
So in his book, Centered Church, Tim Keller kind of explains that the kind of healthy standard for the explanation of like what's a good way to evaluate a healthy church is not based on its success or its by its faith, but rather on its fruit.
ある教会は献金額とかまた教会員の数など一般的に成功に見える基準を教会の評価基準にしがちだったりします。
So often many churches kind of tend to base the standard of evaluation on things that can kind of what be seen as maybe successes in kind of like normal way that we think of success, kind of based on maybe how much offering the church is getting or how many people are going to the church.
また反対にある教会は聖書を正しく理解して神への信仰に固く立っているかどうかを評価の基準であると考えたりします。
Or on the other hand of the spectrum, there are churches that kind of base the standard of evaluation on maybe how well they understand the Bible or how kind of accurate or solid their faith is.
それに対しティモシー・ケラーはこの成功や信仰のどちらもが極端で危険であると述べています。
However, Tim Keller says that actually both of these ways of thinking about maybe focusing too much on success or faith, that both of these are actually a little bit too extreme and actually kind of dangerous.
彼は長い経験を通して宣教の働きを評価する基準というのは成功や信仰ではなく実りであるべきである、そのような結論に至っています。
Through many years of experience, he's actually come to the conclusion that the standard for evaluating a church's work should not be based on its success or on its faith, but rather on its fruitfulness.
ノンクリスチャンがクリスチャンになるということも一つの実りだったりします。
So, for example, a non-Christian becoming a Christian, that's one example of fruitfulness.
でも実りっていうのはそれだけではなく、改心したものが神の見姿に似せられていくことも実りに含まれます。
However, fruitfulness isn't only that. It can also include things like this new convert, this new person who has become a Christian, also growing to resemble more and more Christ's character.
今日これからお読みする聖書では、パウロがローマの教会にいる人たちに対してそのような実りが育つことを願っています。
In the passage that we'll read today, Paul is asking that the people in the Roman church, and he was asking that they would bear this kind of fruit.
そしてパウロは実を実らせるためにローマを訪問しようと願っています。
And in order to help them in this kind of fruitfulness, he also desires to go visit them in Rome.
しかしパウロにはローマを訪問したいという願いがすぐに叶えられない現実もあります。
However, there was this reality that his wish to go to Rome was not immediately granted.
そのことを今日は見てまいります。
And that's what we will look at today.
今日お読みする聖書はローマ人への手紙の1章9節から13節までとなります。
So the passage we'll be looking at is Romans 1, 9 through 13.
朗読は日本語のみでお読みいたします。
So we'll be reading the passage only in Japanese.
私が御子の福音を伝えつつ、心から仕えている神が証ししてくださることですが、私は絶えずあなた方のことを思い、祈る時にはいつも神の御心によって、今度こそついに道が開かれ、何とかしてあなた方のところに行けるようにと願っています。私があなた方に会いたいと切に望むのは、御霊の賜物をいくらかでも分け与えて、あなた方を強くしたいからです。というより、あなた方の間にあって、あなた方と私の互いの信仰によって、共に励ましを受けたいのです。兄弟たち、知らずにいてほしくはありません。私は他の異邦人たちの間で得たように、あなた方の間でもいくらかの実を得ようと、何度もあなた方のところに行く計画を立てましたが、今に至るまで妨げられてきました。このローマといった世界の中心では多様な文化が集まっています。
Rome, which was called the center of the world at the time, was this place where many diverse cultures congregated together.
東京と似たところがありますが、そこではさまざまな人の価値観がぶつかり合っています。
It was a place very similar to Tokyo where values of many different people would come and clash with each other.
私の家でも国際結婚による価値観の違いからさまざまなバトルが生じています。
And my own home as well is an international marriage, and so we have a lot of different kind of battles that arise from different cultural kind of viewpoints clashing with each other.
ローマ教会の中にもそのような価値観の違いというのがありました。
So being in this kind of environment, the Roman church had also within it many different values clashing with each other.
違法人クリスチャンとユダヤ人クリスチャンが共存する中で分裂する危機にもありました。
There was actually this crisis of division within the church, kind of between the Gentile Christians and the Jewish Christians who were coexisting there.
その中でパウロはローマの教会にいる人たちに十分なケアが必要であることを知っていて、彼らのことを心から愛し取りなしています。
So Paul knew that it was necessary to provide enough care for the people in the Roman church, and so he is there loving and interceding for them from the heart.
9節でこのようにやります。
So this is how he says it in verse 9.
私は絶えずあなた方のことを思い。
He has this phrase where he says that without ceasing I mention you.
この絶えずというのは中断することなくといった強調した意味の表現になっています。
So this part where it says without ceasing, this is an expression that kind of emphasizes the meaning of without any interruption.
パウロは常にローマの教会のことを思い、神に祈っています。
Here Paul is constantly thinking of the Roman church and praying to God about them.
今日の聖書からパウロはたとえクリスチャンであったとしても十分すぎるほどのケアが必要であり、そしてその人たちのことを思い続けているのを見て取れます。
So in our passage here today, we can learn that Paul saw that it was necessary for even Christians to experience care on a level that seemed almost like maybe even too much, and that he thought of and he cared for these people continually.
今年の初め頃にですね、フジテレビで放送されたドラマにテミスの教室リーガル青春白書というドラマがあったんですけれども、ご覧になった方いらっしゃいますでしょうか。
So it just aired on Fuji Television for the first time this year, but has anyone seen the drama, which as far as I know doesn't have like a legitimate English translation, but it's like Temis's Classroom Legal Youth White Paper? There might be an official English, I'm not sure.
私の視点から誰も手を挙げていないんですけれ
So
ども、
nobody seems to be raising their hand, so we can go look it up later.
おそらく視聴率も低かったと思います。
So maybe there's not many people who are actually watching the show.
このドラマはですね、法律の専門学校であるロースクールに通う学生たちと主人公の柊先生による青春ドラマとなっています。
And so this is kind of one of those youth dramas about this one teacher at a law school and all of the students who are going there.
他の先生たちがですね、弁護士試験に合格するための授業をしているのに対して、主人公の柊先生は実践で働く上で大事なことを生徒たちに教えようとしています。
So as opposed to the other teachers who basically just teach how to pass the law examination, this one teacher, Hiragi sensei, they actually teach the students through more experiential ways of teaching.
その一つにですね、弁護士は依頼人のことを思いながら深く知る必要があるということを教えます。
And one of the things that they teach is the idea that a lawyer needs to deeply know and understand their client.
ある日の授業で柊先生が銭湯について学生たちに話し合いをさせました。
So one day in class, Hiragi sensei basically has the students have a conversation about sentos or onsens.
タトゥーを理由に銭湯の入浴を断ることの法律的な是非について話し合いをさせます。
And specifically, she has them talk about whether or not it is kind of legally okay to have sentos refuse entry to those with tattoos.
当初、学生たちはタトゥーを入れて入浴をするならば、断られても当然というふうに意見をまとめかけるんですけれども、
And at first, the students basically start to kind of say like, well, yeah, well, isn't it kind of obvious that they shouldn't be allowed to be going into the sento because they have a tattoo? Like, that's obvious.
その時先生はこの依頼人のことをもっと想像するようにとアドバイスをしました。
But that's when Hiragi sensei advises them like, well, you need to actually think more about the client's point of view. You need to think about their perspective more.
するとそこからですね、最初はタトゥーを入れた人は怖いっていう先入観で見ていた学生たちも話し合いをする中で、タトゥーには可愛くておしゃれなタトゥーもあるので、タトゥーが怖いから入浴禁止っていうルールはおかしいと考え方が変えられていきました。
And that's where the students actually start to say things more like, well, they kind of realize that they have these prejudicial thoughts of like, oh, well, I think people with tattoos are scary, but then they keep talking and the story kind of unfolds where they're like, okay, well, actually, I think some tattoos are kind of cute and I think that tattoo is kind of cool. And then eventually they come to the conclusion of like, isn't it kind of weird that there's like a law against letting people go into the center just because it makes people think like, oh, that person might be scary. I don't know. Isn't that kind of weird to have a law like that?
先生は弁護士が依頼人から依頼を受けたとき、これでもかっていうくらい依頼人のことを想像しなければいけないんだということを生徒たちに教えました。
So through this experience, the teacher was showing the students and teaching them that they need to imagine like even all of these other possibilities. You have to think of all these possibilities that the client might have.
相手を思いながら考え続けることで相手の立場が見えるようになったりもします。
So in the scene, they continue to think about the other person, and then the other person's position and where they're coming from becomes more and more apparent.
それが弁護士という仕事では大事だと彼女は学生たちに教えました。
And this is what she taught the students as being really, really important in the profession of being a lawyer.
このような相手のことを思いながら接する態度というのは、弁護士だけではなく、組織でリーダーをするときや、またそれだけではなく、自分の仲間や家族に対しても同じことが言えるんではないでしょうか。
This way of putting yourself in the other person's shoes and seeing things from their perspective is not limited to lawyers only. It's something that we can say also applies to leaders of an organization or just in our relationships with friends and family as well.
というのは、パウロはローマ教会のメンバーでもありませんし、ローマ教会のリーダーでもありません。
And this is something that Paul taught even while not being a member or a leader of the Roman Church.
でもパウロは絶えずローマの人たちのことを思っています。
However, Paul is here and he's thinking of the people in Rome without ceasing.
相手のことを考えて取りなす姿が今日の聖書の前半に見られます。
We can see in the first half of the passage that he is thinking of the other person there and he has this posture of interceding for them.
そして12節になると、今度はパウロ自身も励ましを受けたいと書かれています。
If we look at verse 12, it is written that Paul also wants to receive encouragement himself.
12節、あなた方の間にあって、あなた方と私の互いの信仰によって共に励ましを受けたいのです。
In verse 12, it has the phrase where it says that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine.
彼はローマの教会を励ましたいと言っているのではなく、共に励ましを受けたいと述べています。
So he isn't expressing that he just wants to come and encourage the Roman church. He's actually saying that he wants to come and then be mutually encouraged together.
ここにも実りの秘訣が見て取れます。
So here also we can see one of the keys to fruitfulness.
健全な教会や組織っていうのは一方的な教えによって成長するものではなくて、互いに教え合う交わりによって成長します。
So we can see that a healthy church organization is not one that just grows through one-way teaching, but rather one that goes through kind of this fellowship of mutual teaching.
牧師であってもリーダーであっても人生の先輩であっても謙虚でない姿が組織の健全さを奪ってしまいます。
So even a pastor, a leader, or someone who just has a lot more experience in life, if they don't have a humble posture, it robs the organization of its health.
以前ゲイリー・マッキントッシュという人が書いたサイズ別に分析する教会形成の方策という本を読んだことがあります。
So in the past, I've read this book called One Size Doesn't Fit All by Gary McIntosh.
この本は主人公の牧師がこれまで2カ所の教会で合計7年の奉仕をした経験を持っていました。
And in the book, the pastor, who's this main character, he has this experience at 2 different churches working there, and he has a total of 7 years of experience.
そして進学校で学んだ経験も彼はあります。
And he had also gone to seminary.
主人公は3カ所目に招聘された教会でもうまくいくと思い込んでいました。
And so when he was invited to pastor the third church in his career, he just kind of assumed that it would go smoothly.
そしてこれまで大規模教会で成功したプログラムをそのまま新しく赴任した小規模教会でも適用したんですけれども、思うようにはいきませんでした。
And so he introduced the same program from his previous big mega church into this new small scale church. And he thought it would just go really smoothly, but it didn't go as planned.
その時、彼は教会員の反応を受け入れました。
But when that happened, he accepted the reaction from the church members.
教会員がなかなか思うように動かなかったり、または来る礼拝者の人数が減ってしまったりと。
Things like them not really kind of acting the way that he thought they would, or just the congregation just generally kind of declining and decreasing in numbers.
そのような反応を見て、彼は謙虚にコンサルタントの耳を傾けることにしました。
So at that time, he humbly takes his failure and he goes to a consultant to talk about it.
そして彼は教会の立て直しへと向き合っていきます。
And from that, he tries to make the most of it and uses what he's learned to rebuild and try again.
もし彼が過去の成功体験におごりを持っていたのであれば、小規模教会でうまくいかなかった理由を自分ではなくて、自分のやり方についてこれない人たちのせいにしたかもしれません。
So if, for example, he had great pride in his previous successes, it's possible that he may have blamed things not going well, not on himself, but rather on the church members not getting on board with his ideas.
でも彼はそうではなく、教会員の反応から学び、謙虚に自分のやり方を改めようとしました。
However, instead, he chose to learn from the church members' reaction, and then he chose to humbly change his way of doing things.
それによって彼は小規模教会には異なるやり方が必要であるということを知るようになります。
And then it's through this experience that he learned about the necessity of having a different approach for a small-scale church.
そのような周囲に耳を傾けるという謙虚さが教会とか組織の中では必要になります。
So this kind of humility of kind of listening to what other people are saying and to really pay attention to what's going on around you is very important in churches and organizations.
ローマ教会は分裂の危機にもあり、福音の理解も不十分でした。
The Roman church as well was in the crisis of division and it didn't have enough understanding of the gospel.
そんな彼らにパウロは相手のことを深く思い続け、その相手に一方的に教えるのではなくて、相手に対する謙虚さを持って接しています。
And here we can see that Paul is constantly deeply thinking of the other people in prayer. He isn't just kind of cramming teaching down on them in this one-way kind of way, but he's rather taking this posture of humility towards them.
自分も常に学び、そして成長する謙虚な姿勢によって実りを実らせようとする姿が見て取れます。
So when we persistently seek to learn and take on a humble posture of growth, then we're able to actually see fruitfulness play out.
そしてパウロはこのローマ教会に実りをもたらせようとしますが、今日の聖書を見るとその働きが妨害されているとも書かれています。
So Paul is trying to bring about fruitfulness in the Roman church, but as we can see in today's scripture, his work was hindered.
13節、あなた方の間でもいくらかの実を得ようと何度もあなた方のところに行く計画を立てましたが、今に至るまで妨げられてきました。
So in verse 13, as it says, I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you.
私たちは何かをやろうとするときに、時に妨げに遭うことがあります。
So often, we as well, when we have something that we want to do, there's often times where there's something that is hindering us from doing that thing.
その時、その原因をサタンにしがちかもしれません。
And I think we have a tendency to often attribute the cause of that hindrance to Satan.
しかし私たちの働きが妨げられるとき、その妨げが神によってもたらされることもあります。
However, we may be overlooking the fact that some of the times it might be God who is the one who is bringing that hindrance.
パウロはローマ以外にもさまざまな場所で宣教する必要がありました。
So Paul needed to go out on a mission to a lot of other places in addition to Rome.
そしてこの後もユダヤ人の貧しいクリスチャンのためにエルサレム教会に献金を届ける必要もありました。
And at this point in time in the passage, he also needed to go to Jerusalem afterwards to bring an offering to the Jewish Christians who were kind of impoverished there.
それによってローマに行くことが妨げられています。
And so because of that, he was not able to go to Rome.
これは決してサタンによるものとは言えません。
So I don't think that we can say that this was because of Satan.
将来を阻むものがサタンによるものなのか神によるものなのかっていうのは、簡単には分からないものですが、たとえどちらであったとしても私たちはそのようなものを前にしたときに恐れを抱きがちになります。
So we can't just automatically say that something that obstructs the future is just because of Satan. It could be because of God as well. And just because we don't know which one it is, we tend to still kind of fall into anxiety and uncertainty about the future, regardless of which one it may be.
パウロはローマに行きたいけれども、本当に行けるのかが分からずに、そこに不安を抱いていたとも思われます。
So Paul wanted to go to Rome, but many actually say that he was anxious because he didn't know if he would be able to or not.
特にそれが感じられると言われているのが10節ですけれども、ここにはさまざまな不確定要素が詰まった表現が用いられています。
And the reason that many say this is because if we look at verse 10, there's a lot of expressions kind of filled with uncertainty being used.
10節、祈る時にはいつも神の御心によって今度こそついに道が開かれ、何とかしてあなた方のところに行けるようにと願っています。
So in verse 10 it says, "Always in my prayers asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you."
ここに神の御心によってとか、今度こそついに、そして何とかして行けるように願っていますと、これらは断言することができない、そして先が見えない表現が連発されています。
So we have these expressions where he says, by God's will, or that I may now at last, or somehow succeed in coming to you. And these are all expressions that they kind of express an inability to see or declare with certainty about what is to come.
私たちも未来が不確定の時に不安を抱くものです。
So we are gripped by anxiety when the future is uncertain.
もうそれは自然な反応とも言えます。
But I think that is actually a very natural reaction.
そのような時に私たちはどのようにしてその妨げと向き合っていくことができるんでしょうか。
So what can we do in these times to overcome these hindrances?
先ほどの相手を思う心と謙虚な姿勢とともに、もう一つ私たちが知るべきことっていうのは、神の視点で現実をよく見なければ見えてこない時があるということです。
So as I looked earlier about the necessity of having a humble posture and for caring for those around us, there's one more thing that we also need to know, which is that we need to have a healthy perspective of looking at reality from God's perspective.
私たちの判断っていうのは間違いばかりです。
Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to see what we need to do, and that's because our own judgment is filled with error and misunderstanding.
イエス・キリストの十字架も人の目には愚かなものとして映りました。
So even Jesus hanging on the cross, it appeared in the eyes of some as foolishness.
人間の目にはイエスの計画が妨げられたとも取れました。
To some, it looked like a total hindrance to his plan, like he totally failed.
エルサレムにいた宗教指導者たちにとってイエスの存在っていうのはクーデターを起こしかねない危険な人物として映っていました。
And to the religious leaders in Jerusalem, Jesus was basically this dangerous figure who could have maybe caused a coup and kind of could have upturned the whole system.
そのため彼らはイエスを十字架刑によって殺害しました。
And so because of that, they sentenced him to crucifixion.
これによってイエスの計画が断念されたように思われました。
And through this, they were kind of made to think that we've done it, we've overturned his plan, and his plan is now ruined.
しかし人間の目にはそのように映る出来事も神の目には全く異なったものとして映っています。
But if we look at the same exact turn of events from God's perspective, it looks completely different.
それは十字架が神のご意志であり働きの達成でもあったからです。
Yes, because if we look at the cross through God's perspective, we can see that it was actually in the will of God, and it actually was the accomplishment of all of God's work.
イエスの十字架っていうのは人の目には妨げと映っても神の視点では神の御手の中にあるということを教えてくれます。
Because even if the cross of Jesus was seen in the eyes of men as his plan being hindered, we can see that from God's perspective, it was something that was all in God's hands all along.
この人の視点と神の視点とのギャップというのは私たちの生活の中でも起きるものです。
So we have this gap between our perspective and God's perspective, and this also plays out in our own lives as well.
パウロはローマに行くことが妨げられたときに神の視点に立って乗り越えています。
But for Paul, when he was prevented from going to Rome, he was able to overcome this by looking at it from God's perspective.
神の視点に立ったときにこのローマに対して本当のミッションは何なのかって言ったときにそれはローマに行くこと以上にローマ教会に実りをもたらすための働きと言えます。
So when he stood in God's perspective, he was able to see that his true mission was more than just physically going to Rome. It was to bring about fruitfulness into the Roman church.
そうであるならば彼のやるべきことは ローマに行く前に手紙を書くことで、ローマの人たちの成長のために使えることができます。
And so if that's the case, then that's why we can say that before actually physically going to Rome, he was able to then therefore like write this letter to the Romans to encourage them.
そして御心であれば、たとえ今は妨げられたとしても、いずれローマに神が導いてくれるはずです。
And then he knew that even though he wasn't able to go to Rome at this time, if there were hindrances, he knew that even if it was truly God's will, that eventually God would lead him to Rome.
私たちがやろうとしていることを妨げられるとき、神の視点に立って、そして神の助けに頼ることで別の道が見えてくることがある、そういうことです。
And so this is basically by looking at things from God's perspective and relying on His help when we try to do something. When we do this, we're actually able to have new paths open up to us.
私も以前大きな妨げを味わった経験があります。
Me too, I've also experienced a lot of hindrances in my life.
今から約6年ほど前、進学校の試験を受けた時のことでした。
And so it was about 6 years ago when I was taking exams in seminary.
その時私が通っていた教会は過渡期で問題を抱えていたと言えます。
And it's at that time that the church that I was attending was basically in a state of transition and had a lot of problems going on in it.
教会のことを思うと不安が頂点に達していました。
So when I thought about my church, my anxiety just reached its peak.
教会のために何かをしてもですね、教会のためになっていないっていうのを感じる中で、自分がやることに何の意味があるのか、またこれをすることが神のための何の役に立つのか、そんな葛藤を抱えていました。
So when I felt like I did things and it just didn't help in any way, I started to think like, well, what's the point of me doing anything at all? I felt like even if I do this, it's not going to be helpful to God or what He's trying to do here, and I was really struggling.
進学校の試験日、私は全くやる気が出なくなってしまいました。
So on the day of the exams, I had no motivation at all.
朝、聖書を読んでも祈っても力が抜けた状態が続きました。
Even though I read the Bible and I prayed, it didn't change the fact that I felt completely powerless.
でも葛藤した先にあったのは、御言葉を通して神が語りかけたものでした。
However, beyond all of these struggles was something that God spoke to me through His Word.
神による私への語りかけは、たとえ周りの状況が最悪であったとしても、私は必ずあなたを用いて生かす、そういうものでした。
He told me, even if everything around you is the worst possible scenario, I will use you.
この言葉を受け取ったとき、確信を持って力が回復したのを覚えています。
So I remember my strength being restored as I accepted these words and placed my faith in them.
それでも恐れはもちろんあります。
But even there is fear.
でも神が必ず適切な場所を用意するという語りかけは私にとって大きな心の慰めとなりました。
But the voice saying that God would provide this perfect place for me was a great comfort to my heart.
パウロのこの状況は先が見えない状況です。
So the situation that Paul was in was also one where he could not see what was in front of him.
この後エルサレムへの訪問も一体どうなるのか。
What about this trip to Jerusalem? How's that going to go?
彼も恐れを抱いていたはずです。
So he was very just afraid.
実際彼はこの後エルサレムに戻り、迫害を受け、そして牢獄に入れられて大変な目に遭いました。
So in actuality, he did go back to Jerusalem, and then he met this terrible fate of being persecuted and then thrown in prison.
それでも神はそれらの不幸を用いて最終的にパウロをローマへと導いたことが聖書にも書かれています。
But it's actually written in the Bible that even then God used this misfortune, and then he actually did lead Paul all the way to Rome.
宣教における実りのプロセスというのは時に植物や野菜の栽培に例えられることがあります。
And so this process of fruitfulness in missions and in ministry is actually often likened to raising fruit or vegetables and kind of or cultivating a plant.
まず宣教する人によって種が植えられ、水が与えられたりします。
So first the seed is planted by the person doing the ministry, and then it is watered.
でも時にそれはうまく育ちません。
But the seed doesn't always just grow well every time.
うまくいかない時に、お前なんて育たないんだと、裁くのではなく、普通はですね、なぜうまくいかないのか、植物や野菜の反応から謙虚に学ぼうとします。
And so the times when this seed doesn't naturally grow well, this is not a time to just like judge the plant and be like, hey, like, why can't you grow? Why are you not growing? But instead to actually kind of look at it and ask like, oh, like I can actually become humble and take on a learning posture of like, okay, like, why is it not growing? What are the actual causes behind that?
水を与えすぎてしまったのか、また日の光が足りなかったのかとか、そのようなものをですね、工夫しながら収穫を目指していきます。
So, maybe did it have too much water before, or did it not get enough sunlight before? And so you can basically ask and try to figure out all these things and work and try again to get to the point where the plant actually grows well, where you can harvest from it.
さらにそのプロセスには、雨を降らしたり災害から守る神の助けや導きも必要になります。
And in all of that as well, we also need God's help and leading, as He is the one who brings the rain and protects it from disaster.
パウロは相手を思い、そして謙虚に相手から学ばされ、同時に神に頼りながらローマの人たちと関わっています。
So Paul cared for others, and at the same time, he took on this humble posture to learn from them, all while relying on God in his interactions with these people in Rome.
これらのことは私たちが周りの仲間たちと共に生きる上でも同じことが言えるんではないでしょうか。
So can we not say that these same things apply to us in our own lives as we live with all these people around us?
皆さんは生活の中でどんな妨げがあるでしょうか。
So for all of you here today, what kinds of hindrances might there be in your own lives?
周りの相手の人たちをどのように思っているでしょうか。
In what ways are you thinking of and caring for those around you?
神様は今皆さんに何を語っているでしょうか。
What is it that God may be speaking to you in this moment?
今週も神と共に歩んでまいりましょう。
So let's live this out and walk together with God this week.
一言お祈りいたします。
Let's pray.